last week we were talking about who Jesus is and what exactly that means for each one of us. And we talked a little bit about these 4 things on the board, and we said that Jesus has to be one of these 4 things. So he can be a legend, not in like a, what we use the term legend now, but like a myth, right? So like Loch Ness Monster is a legend. But the thing about that is that no historian with any weight is gonna say that Jesus never walked on this earth. There is so much proof that Jesus walked on this earth. He could be a liar, but he knew that he was gonna die. We know that, and he knew that he was gonna die painfully on the cross. So I don't know about you guys, but if I was a liar and I was like gonna be put to death, I would say like, hey, hold up, I'm just lying, don't kill me, right? Like I wouldn't be willing to die for a lie. He could be a lunatic, but there's not that many people who actually will argue this. A lot of people will say that he is like a good person or a prophet, but lunatic basically means like crazy person. So this argument is saying that Jesus was crazy. But the problem with that argument is that Jesus didn't do things that crazy people do, and he didn't say things that crazy people say. So the only thing left on the board is Lord, right? So that means that Jesus is who he said he was, that he is the Son of God. And what we have in the Bible, it says that in John 3:16, which is like probably the most quoted Bible verse in all of time. Actually, can someone actually quote John 3:16? Yeah.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life.
Beautiful.
Wow.
That's exactly. So, how do we know who Jesus is? Right? Where do we go to know who Jesus is? You guys can shout out. The Bible. Yeah, so we use the Bible. And I believe that the Bible, and Stanwich believes that the Bible was written to us from God, but through people, which sounds a little complicated, but it basically just means that God inspired the writers, and then it was all compiled, and all of that was inspired by God. So even though it was like written by humans, like physically written by humans, it was from God. And if you guys have noticed that the different books kind of have like a different sound, so some of them will be like poetic, and some of them, like Proverbs, will be like really short nuggets of wisdom, and then the Gospels will be like more storytelling. And that's because there's different people writing different books. So God used all these different kinds of people. He used like taxpayers and prophets and this murderer named Paul, and it all came together and formed the Bible. But if we're saying that this book here is going to answer who Jesus is, the second question should be, well, can we believe it, right? Is this credible? And we at Stanwich, and I believe that it is. And there's going to be people in your life that are going to say, no, it's not, or there's a bunch of, contradictions. But there's not. It's not in there, and we're actually going to be talking about that more in the weeks to come. And you'll also hear people say that we use the Bible as a feel-good book, or just like a book to learn morals and good lessons. But the Bible is so much more than just a book on how to be a good person, because we say that the Bible is alive and active. And by that, we mean that when you read this book, your life changes. I've seen people's lives completely change because they started reading this book. And I've seen my life completely change from following what's in this book. When I was growing up, I used to be like a people pleaser. Like I really liked getting praise, especially from my mom. So I would like get good grades on tests, not just to like be a good student, but it's because I wanted to hear my mom say like, wow, you're so good. Or I'd volunteer and do good things, but not just to like do good things. It was to have friends and strangers and like people that I really don't care about say like, wow, you're such a good person. And I'd be like, yeah, thanks. I know. But now I know, right? The Bible tells me of my worth. I don't have to be searching and finding approval from different people. And so that's just one of the ways my life has changed from reading and following the Bible. So today we're going to talk more about one of the things that Jesus talked about the most, which was how we get into heaven. And I think a lot of you guys have heard someone say this or thought about this, that like, oh, you're just a good person, right? And that's how you get into heaven. But that's not exactly what the Bible says. So who here has brown eyes?
Me.
Yeah. So Lindsay, what did you do to inherit brown eyes?
Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah. So in the same way, we don't earn our way into heaven, right? Lindsay's born with brown eyes, and there's nothing she can do to deserve brown eyes. It was just given to her. And I think a lot of people will think about God in a way of like, he sees the good things you do and he sees the bad things you do, and he kind of like weighs them out, and that's how you get into heaven, right? I think that's sometimes how we think of God. But the cool thing is that when we sin and we ask God for forgiveness, he doesn't only forgive us, but he also forgets. So he's not going to be like, I know this happened all the time when I was growing up, but if you ever get in an argument with your sibling or your mom and they bring up something from like 2 years ago and you're like, I thought we were over this, right? So God is not like that. He's not going to bring up a bunch of things that you've done in your past if you've asked for forgiveness, because he doesn't hold that over our heads any longer. And that's something we should be incredibly thankful for, because who here, and you don't have to raise your hands, but who here can say they do more good than bad? I don't know how I feel about that. Some days I'm like, oh yeah, I do more good than bad. But what if we add our thoughts into that? Do we think more good thoughts than bad thoughts? Because I know, like, walking down the street, sometimes I'll have a thought pop into my head. I'll be like, oh, I just thought an awful thought about someone. I have no idea who they are and what they're about. So I think we can all agree that none of us are, quote unquote, good enough to get into heaven, especially if we're thinking about our thought lives. So if none of us are good enough, then how exactly do we get in, right? Haley, can you recite John 3:16 again?
For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life.
Yeah, exactly. So the Bible tells us that that is exactly how we get into heaven, right? And last week we also talked about in our connection groups, like, what exactly do we say when our friends say like, oh, who is Jesus, right? Because it's a hard question. It's a really, really hard question to answer. But I think what's cool about thinking about that question is also we have to acknowledge that one day we're going to be asked that same exact question, and it's not going to be our friends or our family or our mom. It's not going to be Lance or myself or the leaders. God is going to ask us that same exact question of who is Jesus, right? And it also tells us in the Bible, in the last book of the Bible, which is Revelation.
There's one revelation.
There's one revelation. But it says in the book of Revelation that there's a book in heaven that God keeps our names in. And in Revelation 21:27, it says, nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So how do we become saved? That's a huge question in our religion, right? Like, how do we become saved? Well, the Bible says that if we declare with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, and we believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead, then we're saved. And if you haven't ever thought of this or done that, then maybe God is stirring in your heart right now that maybe something is happening, right? because becoming a Christian isn't about raising your hand and reciting Bible verses and stuff like that. I mean, that's a part of it. But it's more so about knowing in your heart who Jesus is, and that you are a sinner and that Jesus died for you. And if you believe those two things, that means you're a Christian. And if today is your first day realizing this or thinking about this, then all the leaders in the room love to talk to you about this. Whether it's today or tomorrow or years from now, if you give us a call and are like, hey, remember me? We will remember you and we will want to talk to you about it.